Hi there. Let me ask you a question. What percentage of your wildlife photo should contain negative space? 20? 50%? 70%? Maybe you've never thought about it. Maybe you don't know what negative space is. Maybe you're sat there thinking, why would I want anything negative in my photo? Well, I'm going to cover all that and a lot more, plus an absolutely brilliant trick to help you improve your photos with negative space, so stick around. So what is positive space and negative space? Well, these are some of the terms that can be really confusing, particularly when you start out in photography, because we tend to think of the words positive and negative as meaning good or bad. But in photography, put really simply, positive space is all the part of your photo that's occupied by the subject, and negative space is all the other areas of your photo, the area that surrounds your subject. It's essential to think about negative space and the balance between positive and negative space to get the best out of your photo. It's about how you catch your viewer's attention. It's about the emotion, the mood and the feeling of the photo. It's about how you guide your viewer's eye through that photo. And it's about underlining what you want to say with that picture. So in this day and age, with so many photos around, every photographer faces the challenge of how to grab people's attention, and negative space plays a role in that. We also all want people to feel something when they look at our photos, whether that is simply a statement like, wow, isn't that lovely? Or something much deeper, a connection. And negative space plays an active role in that mood, emotion, and feeling. So, we're going to make a difference to your photos today with the impact that they have. And I'm going to start out with a couple of basic examples and then move on to things that are a little bit more advanced. So, the first of those techniques is space to stare out of the frame. And this is where it appears that your subject is looking at something that's not in the image. And this creates some curiosity in your viewers' minds, even if that curiosity is only subconscious, they're not actively thinking about it. But the key to it is to make sure that there's negative space in the direction that the subject is looking. So you want more negative space in front of the subject than you do behind it. Such as you can see with this example of a starling perched on a sheep's back. There is more negative space in the direction that the bird is looking than there is behind it. This gives the viewer much more opportunity to wonder. Look at this example of a wren, where there is much more negative space behind the subject than there is in front of it. It just doesn't work so well. In that wren photo, that negative space behind the subject is called dead space, and we'll cover that a little bit later. Next is negative space to move. So imagine you're photographing a bird in flight. And imagine its trajectory. Where is it going to move to? You want to leave some negative space for movement in the direction the bird is flying. But it's not just for birds. Anything that's in motion, you want to leave some negative space for movement in the direction it's moving. Such as in this example, or a red squirrel jumping. You want to imagine the subject occupying the space that it will move into. Now, both of these techniques, space to stare out of the frame and space to move, allow your viewer to wonder what's happening or what's happening next. But they also give your viewer's eye a place to rest as it looks around the photo, which is really important. You don't want things to feel too chaotic, and you don't want anything that's going to lead your viewer's eye out of the photo. So that space to rest is really important. And these are two basic techniques that you'll probably find yourself doing a lot of the time, but there are some more advanced things that you can do with negative space, and we'll move on to those now. So what makes these next few techniques that we're going to talk about that little bit more advanced is because they don't always work. You really have to think about them and the circumstances you use them in, or at least just give them a go and see if they work. But the first of those is positioning your subject high in the frame. In this one of an oyster catcher, I'm low to the ground, cutting across the water's surface, with a pair of oyster catchers positioned at the top. They still adhere to the principle of negative space to stare out of the frame, but they are quite a small part of the photo, with over half the frame taken up by that out of focus water. Now, imagine that these were taken in landscape orientation or a horizontal photo. It changes how the photo feels. Let's look at the two side by side. It's just not as interesting anymore. And you can even do this with birds in flight. Now, photographing birds in flight in portrait or vertical orientation is really difficult because you've got so much less space to make sure that you can keep them in the frame. But one place you can use that is when the bird is flying towards you, because they're not going side to side, so you've got much more space to try and get it right within the length of the photo. And that's what I did in this example here with the gannet. I was photographing it from above on some cliffs looking down on it, and the gannet was moving towards the cliffs. So switching to portrait orientation was a good option. I've given it masses of negative space for movement, and this really helps imagine the bird gliding down the entire length of the photo. Now, let's look at this as though it was taken in landscape orientation. Again, it has totally changed the feeling of the photo, and I would argue that the landscape version has lost all the impact that it had. So let's explore the feeling or mood of the photo when positioning the subject high in the frame. So here's a photo of a rabbit where I've positioned it high up. Again, I was low to the ground, and this time I had lots of yellow flowers that I was cutting across to blur them out. In the same session, I also took a photo in landscape orientation. Now, how everyone looks at these photos and what they feel about them is going to be different, but just take a moment or two to think about how these photos make you feel. Firstly, the landscape orientation photo. And now, how does the portrait orientation photo make you feel? And let's put them side by side. For me, I feel that the landscape orientation shot is quite a nice, sweet photo of a rabbit, but the portrait-oriented shot is different. All that negative space gives me a feeling of isolation. In other words, the landscape picture is a photo of something, a rabbit, but the portrait photo is a photo about something, isolation or loneliness. And that has been created by the way that I've used the negative space. One final example, here's a photo of a kingfisher perched on a post at the edge of a pond. How does this photo make you feel? Now, here's a portrait-oriented picture with the kingfisher on the same perch but positioned much higher in the frame, and there's some foreground grass blurred out around the edge of the pond. How does this one make you feel? Again, the emotion or feeling or mood is going to be different for every single person that looks at these. Much of the negative space in the landscape shot is occupied by the effects of the water. That white bokeh in the background that gives a sense of the water flowing past the kingfisher. Now, the portrait-oriented photo feels different. The kingfisher in both photos is the same size because I used the same focal length for each picture. But with the kingfisher positioned high up in the frame, it feels much more powerful. It's as though the pond is the kingfisher's territory and it's surveying its domain. The portrait picture of the kingfisher makes it feel like it really is the king of that pond. So again, one is a photo of something, water flowing across the pond behind a kingfisher, and the other is a photo about something, dominance. Neither is right or wrong, but the effect and the mood that it creates has been done so by the way that I've used the negative space. So let me know how these variations in the photos made you feel. As I say, it's going to be different for you than it will be for me, than it will be for another person. It's not about which one you prefer, but it's about recognising that making changes and taking variations in these photos can create a different mood, a different feeling, a different emotion. And so it's important to try and capture as many variations as you can. But think about them. Think about what's going to work and how you can make the best of the time that you've got to create the widest variety of photos that will create the widest variety of moods, feelings and emotions. So let's have a look at a few examples of positioning the subject low in the frame with lots of negative space above it. In this first one, we've got a grey seal pup lying in the sand dunes, and I've positioned it low in the frame, and I don't think many people would. I think most people would have centred the seal pup in this circumstance, but the seal is looking upwards. And so I've positioned it low in the frame to create that negative space above it in the direction that it's looking. It makes you think, what has caught that seal's attention? Perhaps it's a bird flying over. Perhaps there's a plane in the sky. Perhaps it's about to roll its head backwards and look at me. But I think most people only consider negative space for looking out of the frame when they're looking out of one side or the other. But that negative space that you leave could be in any direction. Could be upwards, could be to one of the corners, could even be downwards. You leave negative space in the direction that the subject is looking. And here we've got a green woodpecker. There's definitely more negative space in front of it than there is behind it. However, there's a lot less negative space for staring out of their frame than there would have been if this had been taken in landscape orientation. And as a result of that, it feels quite tense. Because of that narrowness of the gap between the bird and the edge of the frame, you don't know how close the thing it's looking at is. And in this case, the bird is particularly upright, it's looking alert. So that makes you think, could there be a potential danger? Is there something that's caught this bird's attention that it needs to worry about? And tension in a photo isn't a bad thing. In fact, tension can be really helpful. And I'm going to be having a video coming out fairly soon that's all about tension, so I'll go into that a little bit more then. But the tension at the bottom half of the photo is counterbalanced by the light and airy negative space in the top half of the photo. And in this photo of a red deer, I've positioned it right at the bottom of the frame. There's a really beautiful background. Now, imagine this photo had been taken with the red deer centred in the middle of the picture and much less negative space above it. There would be less of that beautiful background. So I've used the negative space and the position of the subject to convey more information about this location at this point in time. Or, as we often say in photography, I've used the negative space to tell a story. And that is the next tip. So we're going to move on to using negative space to tell a story now. So let's start with this photo of a backlit razorbill. Most of the negative space is occupied by that beautiful golden bokeh in the background. So you can infer that there must have been a golden orange light source behind the subject. And because this was an outdoor photo, you know that light source must be the sun, without the sun even featuring in the photo. So you can use that negative space to tell a lot about what's going on in the picture at that point in time. And here we've got a pregnant grey seal cow, and I've used the negative space in the top half of the photo to show the beach and the sea with lots of other seals blurred out in that background. So here I'm showing the annual haul out where seals come onto our beaches en masse to give birth to their pups. And if you're really observant, you'll notice that there's a bulge in this seal cow's belly. She has got a pup in there that she'll be giving birth to very soon. So again, I've told much more of a story and conveyed much more information with how I've used the negative space in conjunction with the positive space. And in this photo, we see a really tiny shag perched upon an anchor buoy for one of those boats. The positive space, the primary subject, the bird, is the smallest thing in the picture. The secondary subjects, the boats, take up a bit more of it, but the majority of the space is taken up by those hills in the background. So I've given this subject a lot of context by the choices that I've made about the negative and positive space and the balance between them, even though this subject is really tiny in the frame. And so this brings me back to the question I asked right at the start of this video. What percentage of your photo should be negative space? And the answer really is as much as it needs to be. But I would argue that in most circumstances, without at least 50% of the photo being negative space, it's really hard to convey so much emotion, so much feeling, or to give your viewer somewhere other than the subject to look, which is really important We need to give people's eyes some opportunity to move around, to look at different things, to infer things from your photo. And we also need to give people's eyes a space to rest as they move around. So having the subject really large in the frame can be useful, but you certainly don't want to be doing that most of the time. Most of the time you need probably at least 50% negative space. So let's talk about dead space. Now, dead space is negative space that occupies a lot of the photo and does nothing to enhance the mood, feeling, or convey any information. It's space that isn't doing anything to actively help your photo. So here's an example of a red kite, and this is a good example of what I regard as dead space. There's a huge amount of negative space occupied by that empty sky. And some people might say, that's okay. It represents the vastness of the sky that the subject could move into. But I think that argument is a little contrived. And in this circumstance, I think that the photo does have dead space in it. Now, if you're wondering whether your negative space is dead space or not, there's a little exercise that you can do. Just stare at that photo for a while. And then once you've done so, ask yourself, if I cropped this photo down, would it increase, would it intensify the feelings, emotion or mood of the picture? Would it help convey more information, or would the cropping just convey the same thing but with less negative space? So if your photo is intensified in its mood by cropping it, it's probably dead space. And if cropping it doesn't convey any less information than it would have done before, there's a chance that that could be negative space. So experiment with cropping it then and think about which crop of that photo makes you feel best when you look at it. So next we're going to talk about breaking the rules. And I really dislike that we have so many things in photography called a rule. Most of these rules are actually just guidelines, things that it's a good idea to do most of the time, but it doesn't mean you have to do them all the time. And the fact that we have things that are called rules makes people think they have to do them. It confines their thinking. And definitely knowing when is the right time to break these rules or go against the guidelines is a good thing to develop. Even when to go against the guidance I've given in this video. Guidance is something that you should do often. It doesn't mean you have to do it always. So firstly, this is an example of a black-browed albatross. It has much less negative space in front of it than it does behind it. But the negative space behind it is being occupied by a secondary subject, a cliff face that's covered in gannets. And I've used that negative space to tell a story. So this albatross was a rare visitor to the Northern Hemisphere. It normally would live in the Southern Hemisphere, actually really close to the Antarctic, and somehow it wandered off course and found itself on the coast here in the UK. And whilst it was here, it spent its time living with gannets. And gannets are probably the bird that is closest to the albatross, both in terms of size and behaviour. So although I've not given it much space for movement, I have broken that rule about space for movement, but it works in this circumstance. Then we've got this one of a diving puffin, and this breaks all the rules. There's not enough negative space for movement, there's not enough space to stare out of the frame, and a lot of the empty space could be considered dead space, but I don't think it is. So for me, this photo works for two reasons. Firstly, it's a diving bird. And when we see a diving bird with our own eyes, not in a photo, we don't expect to see it for long. That bird is going to emerge into the water, or it's going to fly into some grass or behind some trees or something. When you're seeing a bird flying across the sky, you expect to see it for a long time. So if you think about that in terms of a photo, it would fly beyond the edge of the frame, but you'd be able to carry on seeing it with your own eyes. When the bird is diving, think of a bird of prey, for example. There's an owl or a marsh harrier or something like that diving into some long grasses to pick up a mouse. You would expect to not see that bird once it's gone beyond the line of the grasses. And so, It kind of works in photos sometimes to have diving birds that are near the bottom of the frame. Doesn't always work, it sometimes does though. And that's because I think you subconsciously expect not to be able to see it anyway. So the second reason that I think this photo works is because of the line of the sea. If you look at this, you'll notice that the sea is kind of two-tone. And you often see this effect in the sea where maybe the light is bouncing off it in a different way because the clouds are causing some shadows or something, but you get two tones going on. And roughly speaking, the line between those two tones of the sea is parallel to the line that is the imaginary trajectory that the bird is following. And I think that really helps subconsciously. In all these circumstances where we talk about breaking the rules, it will often not work. But when it does work, don't be afraid to use it. So now let's put all of the things we've talked about so far in this video together and see how you could get lots of different variations of the same photo to create different effects, different moods. And don't forget about that genius tip coming up at the end of the video that's really going to help you to do this in all circumstances. So here is a portrait of a puffin, and it's a nice portrait. It does all the things that you might expect in this circumstance. There's negative space for it to stare out of the frame in the direction it's looking. It's composed by thirds with more negative space in front of the bird than there is behind the bird. But I got a few good minutes with this bird, which allowed me to create some variety, some different variations on this photo with the same set of elements in the photo. Same dark background, the same bird sat on the same rock. So firstly, I changed the orientation to portrait or vertical and essentially used the same things as before, but it's a different photo that gives different options for how to use it. But the only real differences are that the puffin has moved its position slightly and I have changed that orientation. Next, we've got a shot where I've used the negative space very differently. It's still in portrait or vertical orientation, and the bird is in a similar position to the first picture. But because there's not much negative space in front of the bird, it feels more tense, like that green woodpecker that we looked at earlier. There's still more negative space in front of it than behind it, but if we compare it to the landscape orientation photo, we can see the differences between the two. We've also got a lot of negative space above the bird, which could sometimes feel like dead space. But I think in this case, it is that counterbalance to the tension in the lower half of the picture. Now we've got some close-up shots of that puffin. The first of which has very little negative space in it, much less than the 50% I talked about earlier. And you wouldn't want to make every photo like this. This is about knowing when to use the rules and when to break them. In this case, it's because I love the contrast and the shadows on the bird's face. With its position relative to the sun, we've got an effect that is similar to what portrait photographers would call Rembrandt lighting. So Rembrandt lighting is where you've got a light source coming down on the person you're taking a photo of that causes its nose to create a little triangle just here that is in shadow and is very reminiscent of the way Rembrandt painted his pictures. In this case, with my puffin, we've got a shadow of its beak crossing it and a beautiful little shadow just under its eye, which helps to show off a lot of the detail in its face. If the lighting conditions were different, say they were more flat, we wouldn't get those shadows from its eye and from its beak, and so I perhaps wouldn't have chosen to take such a close-up of the puffin in that circumstance. But because of the lighting, because of those shadows, because it brings out all of that lovely detail in the bird's face, I've used it. In this one, I've placed the bird up against the right-hand edge with pretty much no negative space behind it, and over half of the photo in front of it is entirely negative space. Now, compare that with the first portrait shot, and I think you'll agree there's a very different mood. If we were to infer some human emotions in the wider full-body shot, the puffin looks concerned. In the closer-up shot, it looks curious, like it might be pondering something. And that has been created because we know much less about its surroundings, but there's a lot of negative space, which allows the viewer to wonder on what the bird might be looking at, what it might be thinking about. If you were to come up with 2 words for the mood of each photo or the emotions of the bird, it might be different to the ones I get, but I think of curious and concerned. But I guarantee that the 2 words you come up with for each picture will be different to each other because the mood is different in each picture. Now, a couple of other ones before we move on to that tip I mentioned earlier, and in this one I've broken all the rules. There's about as much negative space behind the bird as there is in front of it, and there's a lot of negative space above it. But this is one of my favourite techniques, placing the subject's eye right in the centre of the photo. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it creates a mood. If we compare it to the tight close-up shot, you'll feel that each picture has a very different mood to it. I do this a lot, but you might not consciously notice it. Here's a grey seal bull with its eye right at the centre. And here is a rabbit using the same eye centering technique. And then finally, a close-up shot of the bird centred. There's equal negative space on either side and almost none above it. As a little aside, the rule I've broken here isn't so much about the negative space, it's about not having the bird's eye in focus. It's the beak. It's such a prominent point of the picture that I decided that is where I wanted the focus to be. But as with any instance of breaking a so-called rule, do it consciously, do it with some meaning behind it, because when you do it unconsciously, when you do it accidentally, it rarely works. But if we compare all the close-up shots, you can see that each one has a different feeling to it, which is created by how I've used the negative space. But what do you do if you haven't got all the time I had with that puffin? If you get just one chance to photograph the subject and then it runs away or flies away, well, there is still something you can do. And that brings me on to that tip that I've been mentioning. Because for this, you can still create negative space. And I'm going to show you how using my photo assistant, Gurnk. Okay then, so the trick in this situation is to take some extra shots, and you can create that negative space with real photographs in photo editing later. But the difficulty is, if your subject has gone, if it's flown away or run away, you haven't got something to focus on anymore. And so those extra shots that you take might have different amounts of focus for the background. So different shots that you take will have a different depth to the background, and so it won't be easy to match them up. Now, the way to deal with this is one of 2 ways. You either use your back button focus or your camera's focus hold button. But either way, you want to make sure that you acquire focus for the first shot and then don't let the focus change, don't reacquire focus again until you've taken the additional shots. And it takes a bit of practice of getting into the habit of taking your first shot and pressing focus hold, or not reacquiring focus using back button focus, and then taking the extra shots. And if the subject stays there and doesn't move away, you don't need to worry about it anymore. You can keep firing off shots and change things up and get different variations on them. But if your subject has gone, it still allows you to create those different variations of negative space. So let me show you how I'm going to do it. I use the half press to acquire focus and the focus hold function. And your focus hold function will be something that you can assign to one of the buttons on your camera. Very often you can reassign it to different buttons depending on how your camera lets you customize its setup. So I will half press the shutter, press the focus hold button, then take the first shot, keep my finger on the focus hold button and take those extra shots. So we've got Gurnk set up on the fake perch here. I've got my camera on the tripod. You absolutely don't need to have your camera on a tripod for this. You can absolutely do it handheld, but it's just a little easier for me to demonstrate it in this situation. So, here we go. Let's get Gurnk in the frame. So, half press the shutter. Now I'm going to press the focus hold button, which for me is on top of the lens, and take the first shot. Now I'm going to move in front of Gurnk and keep the shot overlapped by about a third, just the same as you would if you were taking a panorama. Now I'm going to go behind him and keep it overlapped by a third. And then I'm going to take 3 shots above him, overlapped by a third with the first 3 shots. So Gurk will appear in the bottom portion of these photos. And next I'm going to go underneath him and take 3 shots where it's overlapped again with the first set of 3 by about a third. So now I can let go of my focus hold button and I've got 9 shots. You can take more than that if you want to. You can take as many as you like, but I've got 9 shots that I'm going to take into photo editing and show you what to do. So here are my 9 photos, and I'm going to be using Lightroom and Photoshop. You can use whatever photo editing software you want to, as long as it's something that lets you work with layers. But the first thing we're going to do in Lightroom is to make our basic edits. So let's have a look at this. I think I want to bring down the highlights a little bit and maybe bring up the shadows a fraction and just sort out that balance in the middle. And then I'm going to add a little bit of vibrance, not much, and maybe just adjust the white balance a little bit. And that feels like it'll do. So you'll see now there's a difference between that photo, the first one, and the second one because I've adjusted things. So you want to copy the adjustments that you used for the first photo. And in Lightroom, to do that, you right-click on the photo, develop settings, copy settings, leave everything checked, copy it, then highlight all the other photos that you want to use the same adjustment settings for, right-click, develop, and paste settings. And you'll see it makes them all look exactly the same. So now we're done in Lightroom, I'm going to head over to Photoshop. And I want to move all of these at once. So I'm going to click the first one of the 9 photos, then the last one, so they're all highlighted, right-click it, edit in, and open as layers in Photoshop. So that is now loading up the layers. It will just take a couple of minutes for them all to load up. So I'll fast forward through this bit. So you'll see here in the layers panel, we've got all 9 of them open and they're layered one on top of one another. So if I turn off the first one by clicking the little eye symbol next to it to turn off the visibility, you can see the next one down in the stack and so on and so forth. So all 9 of them are here. So there are 2 ways of doing this. One is a manual method and one is automatic. The manual method might be useful for you if the automatic method doesn't work. So I'll show you very quickly the manual method. And firstly, we need to expand the canvas. So that's the area we've got to play with. So if we go to image and canvas size, and I want to increase it to 3 times what it is in every direction. So we'll choose percentage and 300% height and 300% width. And let's expand it. So now you will see we've got a much bigger area to play with, and you can manually move these layers around. So I've got the first layer selected, that's the one at the center. If I move the next layer up, so you'll see that one appears, and I'm going to just drop the opacity of that one down to something like 70, so you can see one on top of another. And if we take over here the little move tool, I can grab that and move it around and figure out where these pictures overlap. Then I'm going to turn the opacity back up. Next, I'm going to take the next one, turn the opacity down again, and figure out where they're going to overlap. And that way, I can line them all up. Now, there is a much easier method to do this, which is automatic. And hopefully the automatic method will work. But sometimes, particularly if your subject has disappeared, it's flown off, something like that, it doesn't always recognize where it needs to overlap them. So let's undo this to the point that we had them all stacked together. And I'm going to select all of these layers by clicking the bottom one, Shift, and then the top one. I'm going to come over to Edit and Auto Align Layers. So we want to remove any vignettes, so the darker bits around the edge of the photo, because that will make it easier to blend later. And we're going to allow it to account for any geometric distortion. Click OK, and it will take a moment just to think about it and line all of these up. And here we can see it's done a pretty good job. So we've got all of these photos lined up. You'll see there's a little bit of a line where they all meet, and we're going to sort that out. But the first thing I'm going to do is just crop it down to get rid of these transparent parts at the edges. You can allow it to fill those in for you, but I don't think we need to bother. So let's go to crop, and if I go to ratio, no, W by H resolution, I can drag it to whatever shape I want it to be. So we'll just go to just inside those little areas of transparency and click OK. And the next thing we're going to do is go to Edit and Auto Blend Layers. And in here, you want to make sure you've got Seamless Tones and Colours ticked, because that will sort out the colours where the lines of these photos meet. And you might as well leave Content Aware Fill Transparent areas. Doesn't look like there are any. It looks like it's overlapped them all well, but there's no harm in leaving it ticked just in case. So let it do its thinking. And there, we've got a pretty good image to work from. So if I now come over and pick the crop tool again, and I'm going to start with, let's say, a 1x1. So square crop, going to bring it in, place gunk somewhere in the center, OK. And there we've got our first variation. So I could save that, square photo, might make something OK for Instagram, for example, or something like that. Next, let's come back. And this time I'm going to do a different crop. We're going to go for 16:9. Let's just drag that in. And I think we'll place gunk over towards the right-hand edge, maybe a little bit higher in the frame. Click OK. And there we've got a different variation on it. So if I take this back again, and this time I am going to pick a 4x6 vertical, and we're going to leave gunk fairly high in the frame. So let's drag that top down, leave him slightly to one side, and OK that. So there we've got another variation. And next I'm going to try a 4x3. No, a 4x5. Let's go 4x5. And I'm going to place gunk in the bottom part of the photo. So he is looking up slightly, and we've got this nice blended to almost white area at the top. And again, there we've got another variation. And you can make as many variations as you want to from this, because you've got that blended big photo from which you can create lots of crops and lots of different aspect ratios with different amounts of negative space. Now, I know this isn't a particularly inspiring photo because it's just a picture of a toy on a stick, but hopefully from this demonstration, you can realise how powerful this can be if you use it with a real wildlife subject. So, do you think about the consequences of your choices when it comes to using negative space? Do you consciously try to create different variations on your photos to have photos with different moods in them by how you've used the negative space? Well, if not, I would recommend you give that a go. And hopefully, after watching this video, you will have the tools to do so. Now, I hope you've enjoyed that, and if you have, I would recommend that you take another walk on the wild side with this one. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.